Membership in the Catholic Church, especially among younger generations, is exploding in popularity. Just last year, the number of new converts to the church reached a nearly 20-year high, driven, at least in part, by young men searching for a faith with masculinity, with authority, something that feels tangible, rooted in ancient traditions. But alongside this rise in Catholicism, something else is rising as well. Something that's Catholic in character, but not necessarily Catholic per se. It's called Catholic Integralism. Its purveyors put it forward as though it were the official politics of the Catholic Church, but we're not sure that's entirely true. Here to help us learn more about it is my guest for the day, James M. Patterson. Patterson is a Catholic scholar who's dedicated the last few years to understanding this movement from the inside. James M. Patterson is an associate professor of public affairs in the Institute of American Civics at the University of Tennessee's Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. He's also a contributing editor at Law and Liberty. He's president of the Ciceronian Society, and he's an affiliated scholar for the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. He's written 2 books, Religion in the Public Square, and the upcoming book, Why Post-Liberalism Failed. He joined me today to help us all understand a little bit about what's meant by Catholic integralism and post-liberalism more broadly on the right. James Patterson. It's the year of our Lord 2026, and a question no one thought they would be asking. Is there a Catholic plot to overthrow the American founding?
No, but yes. Yeah, so the story with this, of course, is the story of Catholic integralism. And generally speaking, American Catholics have no idea what that is.
American evangelicals don't have much of a clue either.
Yeah.
So that's what we're hoping you can help us understand.
Well, I'll do my best.
Well, we should start at the starting place. What is integralism?
So Catholic integralism refers to an arrangement between church and state that starts with this very old church statement called duo sunt. That just refers to there are two, and there are two powers, the temporal power and the spiritual power. The temporal power is independent, Romans 13, right? You know, you have ordained power that's separate from spiritual power, but the spiritual power can place duties on the government. And in this case, it was in the 6th century, and it was to suppress heresy. And that duty for Catholic integralists indicates that the government has a role in imposing right religion. And in modern terms, that means that there needs to be a confessional state, that confession must be Catholic, and that all those who are not Catholic but are baptized are subject to church authority. So that would mean, you know, everything from losing rights and privileges to vote to, you know, possibly being put in jail until they get right with the church.
How old is this tradition?
Depending on who you ask, it starts in its modern form in the 1930s, although it kind of is building steam as early as the 1890s. But they would argue that it's been the tradition from the beginning. But I'm right.
Give me their best argument. Let's steel man the thing. We don't want to, we never want to swat at straw men around here.
No.
What is the integralist argument for integralism? How far back does it go?
So they would argue that upon the creation of the Catholic Roman Empire, right, after Constantine, there was the fulfillment of a political theology that before had been conditioned by persecution. So Catholics very strongly, emphatically sided with political liberty for all religions, but upon the achievement of an established church, first with the toleration under Constantine, then later its complete establishment, you have now increasingly the church becoming as much of a role in public life as the empire. And there's this moment that you often find they very much embrace, which is this moment when Theodosius, the emperor of Rome, is excluded from Mass on the basis of performing some kind of violent act or some sort of rebellion in which he murders people. And St. Ambrose of Milan denies him entry until he confesses and does penance. And that's supposed to be the model that we look to, right? That you have a personal sovereign who rejects their own sinfulness in the name of sanctity, and that it's the church that imposes this. Another person they really look to is Saint Louis IX, who was a French king. The name of the city, St. Louis, is after him. There's a statue of him. And St. Louis IX was a great patron of the church and went on crusades to, relieve Christian communities in North Africa. Doesn't succeed, but the point is that he dedicated the entire nation of France to the purposes set by the Catholic Church. And that what this does is it sanctifies the nation, places the nation in the care of providence, and that there will be blessings that come from this as well. And the view is that this model worked until there were sort of problems that surfaced, first with the Reformation, and then second with the introduction of liberalism. This idea of classical liberalism with Adam Smith, and then its radical departure in France that leads to the French Revolution, and that this liberalism is really no different from the kind that you see in England. It just takes on a more radical form in France, but they're both equally bad. And then the final permutation is communism. These are the three steps that Integralists will talk about, and the apostasy of the West: Protestantism, liberalism, and communism.
Why are we talking about this now? Because I operate in the political sphere, I've been aware of integralism as a concept for several years now. I think a lot of people in everyday America are probably only just now beginning to become aware of it, in part because of a Twitter post by Insurrection Barbie,
right,
in which she holds up integralism as a sort of threat to not only the conservative movement in this country, but perhaps sort of America's civics more broadly.
Right.
And that piece upset a lot of Catholic readers. I've had the opportunity to speak to Catholic readers about what they were upset about, and there seem to be two camps. One camp is people who adhere to integralism, and that is a much, I think, bigger camp within politics. I'm not sure that it's a big camp within the country, but it's a very big camp right now within Republican politics, on the one hand. On the other hand, it was a lot of Catholics who aren't very familiar with the concept of integralism, who felt that the piece was an attack on Catholicism per se.
Right.
And I didn't feel that was a fair reading of Insurrection Barbie's piece, but I suspect that if integralism indeed is a fringe enough concept, even within the sort of mainstream of American Catholicism, that the piece would probably feel like it was, painting with a very broad brush and attacking Catholics more broadly. And so I suppose my question for you is, how big is this movement? And is this even a conversation worth having? Is this a real phenomenon?
So it is not on the scale of, like a civil rights movement, right? But it's not supposed to be. The reason is that the sort of chief theorists of integralism in the United States, someone like Adrian Vermeule, who's at Harvard Law School, don't think you need to do that. You don't need to have like a mass movement. And the reason is that in order to change culture and politics, you really just need to capture the elites. And this has been part of his position for a very long time. This starts as a modern effort in America. Right back in 2015 or 2016, you start to see the efforts to create blogs and social media hubs where integralists would share information and learn about each other and sort of form a network. And within 10 years, now it's a major force in conservative politics and has captured conservative institutions, and even has at least a part convert in the White House in the form of JD Vance, someone who's like called himself a post-liberal, hasn't called himself an integralist, but integralism and post-liberalism are very overlapping.
Define post-liberalism.
Yeah. So there's a lot of disagreement over the term because it gets used by people who don't know what it means, but then people adopt that usage anyway. But originally, in this world, Post-liberalism was another way of saying integralism. And the reason for this is that integralism had a brand problem. By 2020, 2021, a book called Integralism, A Political Philosophy, came out on a Catholic press, and it stated very clearly what integralists want, which are, the stripping of citizen rights from the unbaptized, meaning Jews and Muslims, the use of coercion against baptized dissenters, so Protestants and Orthodox, stripping women of rights and having their representation be done by household leaders like men. There were certain kinds of justification for forms of slavery, very radical text. And so...
Is that text embraced by American integralists as a group?
That's what's so weird. So if you ask, I've asked Sohrab Ahmari, who's been sort of part of this, and he said he wrote a tweet sort of saying that it wasn't a very good book. And that's sort of the way that they've tried to handle it. There is a very sophisticated understanding of the way social media works among this group. So they know that if they draw attention to this text by condemning it, they're drawing attention to the text. And so the way they deal with things they don't like is they don't mention them. And so rather than confront the text and describe what they don't like, if anything, what they do is they change the name for what they're using. So there was this period where integralism was a really strong brand, and then they kind of go through a brand transition. Are we going to call this political Catholicism? Are we going to call this realist Catholicism? Are we going to call this post-liberalism? And that's ultimately where they went. And since then, the term post-liberalism has broadened a little bit to include other groups, but it starts with them.
How did you first become aware of the movement?
So I was a teacher at the Ave Maria University, and there were integralists there.
In Florida? In
Florida, yeah. And, not everyone there is an integralist. It's a very, diverse group of Catholic intellectuals down there. So I don't mean to disparage any, but there were integralists there who taught it and treated it as the official sort of political theology of the church. And it was the first I'd ever heard of this. So I, became interested. I read one of the early major blogs called The Josias, started by a guy named Elliot Milko and his friend Kevin Gallagher, and that people I knew on campus would publish for. And I was surprised. There were a lot of things that were in the mix with this. Some of it made it on into Josiah. Some of it would not make it on. There was a kind of consciousness about what you say and what you write. But a large part of it was like a kind of paranoia about Freemasonry that never really makes it onto the site. But there was also a very strongly anti-liberal component that was originally not just conservative, but there was also a very active leftist group, like Bernie Bro integralists, if you will.
So tell me what's wrong with this statement. Catholic integralists believe that the church teaching should supersede the state.
Right.
That the state should act as a enforcer of church teaching, particularly around moral issues. That the state should be fundamentally Catholic. That citizenship should be premised on being a baptized Christian, and full citizenship a baptized Catholic. And that the American founding ideals, the all men are created equal, representative government, focus on the individual over the state, separation of church and state, that these sort of core American concepts are heretical?
Yeah, that's all right. The only limit that would be placed on church authority over the state would be there were some areas in which the church can't claim competence. So, things like there's no church teaching on how to make a budget, and the church wouldn't want to interfere with that matter because the church doesn't have competence in that issue. But when it comes to things like faith and morals, the church obligates the Christian leader to follow the church understanding of those things. That's the integralist reading, not the Catholic one. It's important to distinguish. The Catholic Church has developed a very different set of political theology.
Well, now that's interesting because, from the outside, one of the things that I hear people say about integralism as they start to first encounter the concept is that it's about the Pope being the lead, the Pope being the president, basically, or the Pope being over the president. But that's not a fair read, is it?
Well, the way it would work would be that on issues that the United States is legislating, like let's assume that the Integralists preserve Congress, which they don't really want to do in most cases, then you would have to operate in consultation at least with the American representation of the church in the form of the bishops. And that might require the Pope to intervene in the event that there's some major disagreement. But that shouldn't happen because, again, only Catholics would be allowed to vote.
Well, you say that there's Bernie Bro integralists, but it seems to me that we're mostly encountering this as a phenomenon on the right at the moment. Conservatives in America don't like the Pope. I mean, for the first time, for the first time ever in the history of the Catholic Church, we can say that the Pope voted for Kamala Harris. Like the Pope has voted in American elections and always voted Democrat, as far as we know, as far as we have any cause to believe. So, is there an inherent contradiction in these integralists saying we need the church to be in charge, but not this church?
Yeah, that gets to kind of long-term thinking that's at work here. The first thing is that again, being an elite-driven movement, the idea is that by capturing the elites, you can then set the choices before the country. So, you don't need to have a mass movement to persuade people to vote for a certain candidate if you control the candidate selection process. And that doesn't mean like you're behind, like pulling levers and strings and all that. Rather, what that means is that you capture conservative institutions that vet candidates. And also just create an environment in which people want to be with you, right? If you're a Harvard law professor, if you're a professor at the University of Notre Dame, you're already positioned well to do elite formation. And this goes toward the church too. The idea is that there are younger priests, most of whom are much more conservative, much more orthodox than boomer priests, as they would be considered. And so it's just a matter of time before you will have a generation of more integralist priests that are more open to that sort of teaching, and replace the Second Vatican Council type boomer priests that we're sort of sending away. And this gets us to the Pope, right? The Pope would be one of those people. And there's also attempts to kind of reinterpret papal statements. For example, the fact that he took the name Leo XIV was for post-liberals a win, because the last Leo XIII, is one of their heroes. And so they reinterpret papal statements.
One of their heroes, why?
He was sort of the last pre-Second Vatican Council church popes that made very robust criticisms of liberalism. Although by that time, the church was not really as concerned about it as it was as communism, because by the 1890s, Leo XIII was reigning. That was more the problem. The other reason they like Leo XIII is he condemned something called Americanism.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so there's two ways of thinking about Americanism. There's the right way and there's the wrong way. So fortunately, what you do if you're an integralist is you confuse people. The right way to think about it is that there was a lot of anger at the American church for getting involved in French politics. There was a bishop named Archbishop John Ireland who was from Minnesota and had a problem with schooling, and it's not that relevant, but he has to go to the Vatican to deal with this issue. And then on his way back, he speaks fluent French. He decides to go speak in France, and he gives a lot of very pro American Republic things at a time when a lot of the French clergy actually wanted to return to monarchy. And so they didn't like this. And then he writes an introduction to a book that talks about the importance of active virtues of participating in government that republics would do. And the French monarchists don't like that either, right? They want to return to what they consider to be a reflective, contemplative subjugation or obedience to a king. And so there's this huge brouhaha. in France and Francophone Canada over the Americans coming in and telling them what to do. It didn't help that we had just beaten Spain in the Spanish-American War. The Jesuits were smarting from this because the head of the Jesuit order was Spanish at the time. And so they make a big stink. And Leo XIII, to deal with this problem, writes a letter called Testem Benevolente Nostrae. And it says, if anyone believes all of the accusations, it believes in all of the doctrine that these people accuse the Americans of believing in, stop. But no one's named for doing so. There's no books that are credited with spreading any kind of heresy. He's really just trying to get everyone to stop yelling. And what this turns into, and this is the wrong way to read it, is that Pope Leo XIII condemned America. And he didn't. The closest we get is that he says that he would like for the United States to establish a Catholic Church. That's not what we're going to do, right? But what's funny is when he makes this request in a different letter, not Testem, but one called Longique Oceani, he's saying this while the Catholic Church is in the middle of a massive anti-Catholic movement, right? So it's very odd. He doesn't seem to know what's going on in America. He's just kind of stating maybe ideally you guys could get, and by establishment, what he means is just there to be funding for Catholic institutions. He doesn't mean that this broad integralist persecution. He just wants there to be funding for Catholic institutions. But the reason that they do this is because the heresy of Americanism sounds like something that they can use. And they don't read the actual papal statements. The papal statements are kind of hard to read anyway. They're kind of written in this very specific theological language that is hard to follow. And the best work on it is out of print. There's a really great book on it by a priest named Thomas McAvoy. So unless you have access to a research library, you're probably not going to know much more than what an integralist will tell you. And so you get this treatment of the American Constitution as somehow condemned by the Catholic Church. But in Longique Oceani, Pope Leo XIII talks about the glorious Washington and how great the Republic has been for Catholics, especially the poor Catholics that were coming, that were finding success. He has just that one reservation in the letter, but most of the time he talks about how great the United States is. It's a very strange issue, but it's one that they'll make a lot of rhetorical use out of, the hope that you won't know the difference.
So to the extent that integralism is devoted to not a conservative project, but what sounds like a very radical project. I mean, to the extent that conservatism wants to preserve the best parts of our tradition, radicalism or reactionaryism wants to overturn. If integralism is indeed a project to overturn the sort of American founding, the American creed, the American system and governmental philosophy as we've known it, and to the extent that it's gaining some traction in actual not only academic circles, but political circles, how concerned should non-Catholics be about the project? Do you see this as something that we look up in 10 years and we live in a completely different country? Or is this mostly not an academic exercise exactly, but is it mostly an attitudinal exercise among Catholics to sort of be re-energized in the political process, perhaps in the wake of Roe? I mean, on the pros of overturning Roe, it's maybe God will spare his judgment of our nation a little while longer because it's no longer federal law that you can mass murder children in the womb. On the con of the overturn of Roe is that the coalition that had existed, for a generation between religious evangelicals and religious Catholics, which really existed primarily to fight against the horror of abortion, was no longer central to our national politics. I mean, still very important at the state level, but no longer central to our national politics. And so perhaps Catholics needed something new to be energized about politically. Which of these two camps are we in?
So there's a lot there. First thing about the movement being radical, this is very important. It is conservative in only one sense, and it's more in a colloquial sense. Okay. It's conservative in that they're in favor of traditional marriage, they oppose abortion, but these sort of sexual mores, maybe also in terms of limitations on things that you can publish, especially pornography, There's something they're very conservative about. But the radical thing is actually a feature of integralism since the 1890s. There was this is a continental European political philosophy, okay, and so it's also very modern. It has this idea of the nation state as a kind of French or German model. It doesn't have like a compound republic of a federal government like the United States under a constitution. And so it's tied up in like an ethnic or a religious component, especially. And what happens is the end of monarchism, the idea that you could restore a crown. And so integralism makes a lot of common cause with right-wing paramilitary groups, like in Austria, the Heimwehr. They're essentially fascist. In Spain during the Civil War, there are integralist groups that are with the Falange, which is a Spanish fascist party. Brazil, there's one too, and there's often a lot of outreach into these parties by Mussolini, and in some cases Hitler, especially in Central Europe, with a Croatian Ustaše and a man named Ante Pavlic. So
when you say fascist, you don't mean in the American media, everybody on the right is a fascist. You mean the actual fascists in Europe.
I mean like Roman saluting, riding boot wearing, Jew collecting, and, persecuting, like real bad people. Like when I said the Ustaše, like, that's a bad outfit. They killed hundreds of thousands of people. And so that is like what integralism ultimately leads to. If you can't have rights of the person unless they're baptized, then those people don't have rights to own property. And if they don't have rights to own property, then you can just take their property and starve them. One of the leading priests of integralism, back when he was still on social media, posted to Twitter, when it was still Twitter, that there's really like a moral case for Jewish ghettos. They didn't work necessarily, but maybe you could get them to work. And so when we talk about this being radical, it's radical, and it's hard to contain sometimes how bad it can be without sounding like you're running around with your hair on fire, or you're like, saying the sky is falling. And that gets to the second part of your question. It's like, how bad does this really get in a country that's as pluralistic and, little L liberal, right? Just people sort of get along to go along. And the answer is hard to know. I will say that America's not inexperienced with this. This has happened here before. There was a tiny little magazine called Triumph, but that doesn't really matter. That's like an old 1970s sort of thing, although it did exist along the lines of talking about forming an alliance with Protestants on abortion. They, by and large, saw Franco's Spain as the best regime. It was really Charles Coughlin who was the person at work here. He was a priest in the 1930s, who was originally from Canada, came to the U.S., worked out of Detroit as the Shrine of the Little Flower. And he was the one who advocated for more of these ideas. Although there was one difference with him, which is that he was not militaristic the way other fascist-aligned people were. He wanted America to stay out of war. And it makes sense, because if America's going to enter into the war, it's not going to enter on the side of Germany or Japan, especially when they bomb us. It's going to enter in on the side of England. And so it turns out that, Coughlin had a direct line in some cases to the Nazi foreign agents that were planting this kind of stuff in the U.S. So it's happened before, although, we don't have that, right? We don't have that apparatus out there. We kind of don't need to though, because social media kind of creates a different context for this thing to flourish. And it won't get us an integralist pope in 50 years. We're not going to have the Constitution dissolved in the creation of Catholic monarchy, right? But what you are going to have is the waste of a tremendous amount of talent of people on these very silly ideas. You're going to have needless provocations between Protestants and Catholics on the right over this very issue. There was already this with Doug Wilson talking about Catholic. This is like, the escalation begins. And as you said, it was precisely this coordination between Protestants and Catholics that was a big part of activism, but it was also with Jews. And Catholic integralism is a big problem with Jews. And if you ever say in social media, like talking about Judeo-Christianity, which is a relatively new thing, they'll be like, well, I mean, why are you saying the Jews have anything to do with this, considering what they did to Jesus? Right. And so there's all these divisions that they're trying to create.
So you're saying the integralists are deliberately creating those divisions?
Yeah.
How does that serve them?
Well, the older coalition of Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, like I said, is relatively new. It starts in the early 20th century, and it's not stable, right? There are reasons why Protestants are Protestant and not Catholic, right? And there are reasons that Catholics are not Protestant. There's reason Jews are neither. And those reasons do not always earn respect with the other groups. Like if I say to you, like, submit to Rome, you're like, no, like conscience, and scripture, right? And it's unearthing the tension. And for a long time, Catholics were on the receiving end of some pretty bad treatment in the United States.
Yeah, America is one of the few places where Catholics and Jews had a kind of alignment that they lacked in Europe for many centuries. And it was because neither of them were a majority of the population here. They were both on the receiving end of a lot of bad things. And so they found themselves allies here on social issues, on civil rights issues, in a way that I think is fairly novel in history.
And it starts off in the 1930s. There's a really great book called Tri-Faith America. I always forget the author's name, but he does a really good job talking about this, where the Jews and Catholics also use Protestant arguments for religious liberty that like Baptists had used against Anglican establishments or Congregationalist establishments. And so there is a kind of Americanizing of Jewish and Catholic political thinking, where one of the pathways to them being part of the country more broadly is they sort of convince themselves of the American project. And like the contrast to someone like Coughlin, who's importing like continental European, basically right-wing socialism or fascism, is someone like Fulton J. Sheen, who's going to be beatified later this year. And he talks about the Declaration of Independence as this like statement of the gospel in politics, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And you can see why, if you're an integralist, you don't want Catholic priests saying that, because if you're an integralist, that's liberalism. And it's also ceding too much ground to Protestants to be able to live in heresy. And they want to control those beliefs.
Yeah, if integralists truly believe that the founding creed of the country, the founding governmental document of the country, which ensconces many of those concepts into law at a very foundational level, if those are indeed heretical documents and heretical ideas, it strikes me that you can't really call yourself America first. I mean, right. If you oppose the country's founding and the philosophy that has largely governed it every single day that it's existed, whatever it is that you're for, it isn't the country that we have or have ever had.
That's right. And the thing about America First now is that it's mostly oppose. And what exactly makes a person America First is, going to Hungary, like JD Vance is going to do. Like, what is why is that not Hungary first, right? It doesn't appear to me that this is a necessary component of being a part of the Trump White House. And so really, it's just whose position makes them appear to be the most loyal to whatever it is, we broadly define on social media to be America First. And the term itself, America First, was really just a way of keeping Americans out of fighting in the Second World War. And so, not necessarily the best provenance. And so I don't understand, in many cases, the effort ideologically to align integralism with the White House. But again, they're not really doing that. Trump is a person of convenience. He's a disruptor.
Yeah.
He did a lot to undermine the previous sort of consensus. This was a big part of the early days of integralism, was getting rid of zombie Reaganism or being against the dead consensus. and replacing it with a new one that would pursue the common good, right? This is a big part of what Sorba Mari's was after he left Commentary magazine. And so what you end up with is a kind of amorphous outfit where everyone's trying to create this new coalition, but also run it.
Yeah.
And, the Integralists didn't end up winning, but they've got a guy who's, really they side with, and that's more of what the Vance position is. Like Vance is sort of their avatar. Although who knows, Vance may not, feel like he has to represent them.
Well, why would we think that JD Vance is an integralist?
He called himself a post-liberal at the launch of Regime Change for Patrick Deneen's book. He's one of these people. He insists that he's not an integralist. He just writes with them, speaks with them, travels with them, and blurbs their books. Right? That is somehow not being part of their crew, but I'm not so sure about that. So they worked very closely with him. He has a lot of influence in Deneen and another guy named Chad Pecknell. They have a lot of influence over the staffers that make their way into the Vance White House. And so the reason that you would consider Vance a post-liberal is because he said he is. Now, to the extent which he thinks that means he's also an integralist, we don't know. And it's partly because he's been playing a little bit of politics, which is of course his job.
Yeah, he's vice president of the United States.
Yeah.
One doesn't get the job without playing a little bit of politics.
And so, one of the weird moments is, for example, that he talks about the subsidies for IVF treatment, right? This is just completely prohibited under Catholic social teaching. Under no circumstances can you engage in this. But Deneen talks about, in Regime Change, Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends. So maybe you say that you'll support those things, but ultimately what you're trying to do is preserve the common good by achieving political power and then using that power to reverse the very thing that you claimed to support before. Now, this is a lot of ends justify the means thinking with names and highfalutin language attached, but that's part of what makes this difficult, is that there's a kind of strategic element that reflects their own conspiratorial thinking back onto the way politics is supposed to operate.
In what way are they conspiratorial?
So when Adrian Vermeule has talked about this, he actually wrote with a professor named Cass Sunstein a law review article called Conspiracy Theory, in which he talks about cognitive infiltration of ideological groups. And what you do is you create like opportunities by undermining existing gatekeepers and replacing them with like yourself or with others. And a lot of people have made a big deal about this because that's what they've been doing. So I don't know if that's like the game plan. I think that can sometimes be giving him a little too much credit. Circumstances and events really affect these things more than, Adrian and his Harvard Law Office,
right,
with his evil plan or whatever. But he does talk about this more in terms of sort of a monarchical restoration. He refers to a French anti-revolutionary figure, counter-revolutionary figure named Joseph de Maistre, who he says that in the future, the French Revolution will so exhaust the French people that 4 or 5 conspirators can simply replace the king and everyone will be relieved. And so that's how they imagine this. And in their criticism of classical liberalism itself, like liberalism is like this thing that has marched into our lives and is the explanation for everything that is wrong with foreign trade, with, moral lives of people wanting to be liberated from their, from their natures, right? They want to have surgeries that change their genders, for example. Like everything that you can possibly think of, liberalism is the source, right? So instead of it being like, Jews or Freemasons, it's liberalism, the idea. And so there's a kind of essential conspiratorial quality to the language that's used. In fact, and I'm sorry if I'm carrying on about this.
No, please.
Yeah. If you read the breakout book, which I'm surprised I haven't mentioned, it's called Why Liberalism Failed, that sort of took this subterranean debate and threw it onto the mainstream, at least in conservative circles. Liberalism is constantly doing things. This is a fallacy called reification. Liberalism is an ideology. It doesn't have a body. It can't perform actions. And yet Deneen constantly describes liberalism marching, liberalism choosing, liberalism sort of undermining and driving things. And that liberalism stands for something, and it's kind of hard to pin down what he really thinks it is, but it's like a social force.
Yeah.
One person I saw...
It's anthropomorphic. Is it spiritually so, or is it embodied in a group or a... I don't
Yeah, well, that's the issue, is that historically, like in the 1890s, even before that, like in 1806, as early as that, liberalism as a problem was blamed on Jews, or was blamed on Freemasons. There's this crazy Jesuit priest named Abbe Barruel who writes a multi-volume book blaming the Illuminati for the French Revolution. Goes through multiple translations. It's way more influential than like Edmund Burke. Like, we think Edmund Burke's like the consummate sort of critic, but on the continent, people are reading this stuff. And there's Louis de Bunald, who, you know, people like Deneen favorably cite, who have referred to in their work, and he was like the architect of modern French anti-Semitism. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what they believe. It just means that it's in the sources. So when they maybe want to distance themselves from that stuff, right, which by all accounts they seem to, they still inherit at least the badness of the conspiracy and its way of affecting the way that they think. So even if they don't want to identify certain groups, right? Imagine for a moment like Freemasons doing anything today, right? They're largely elderly people who fund children's hospitals, right? But what they do instead is they inherit the conspiratorial frame of mind. And so liberalism is detached from this like older conspiracy theory, and is now like the way that the left talks about structural racism, right? It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. You look under the couch, there's structural racism keeping people down. Well, and in their case, it's structural liberalism keeping everyone down. And so it's architecturally the same in argument.
Okay. So you put forward a view of integralism that is fundamentally anti-American. It may not be anti-Americans. I'm sure from their point of view, it's not. They think it's in the best interest of Americans to trade liberalism for a sort of theocratic Catholic system of government.
Right.
But it's anti-America to the extent that America has never existed in a way that embraces or even allows for this kind of view of the world. And you would have to destroy America as it is in order to usher in this America that they might be trying to effectuate. If they were here, if I were sitting with Deneen, who may or may not be an integralist, JD Vance, who may or may not be an integralist, Vermeule, who certainly is, very much one, is an integralist, where would they object to your characterization?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because it's harder for me to know the answer to that question than you might think. One of the elements of criticizing integralists is that they typically don't respond the way that you would want them to, where they would engage on the merits of the argument. I can remember, for example, I wrote very early in my attempt to kind of get my head around what was going on, a piece for a website called Law and Liberty. It's operated by the Liberty Fund, called "Why Integralism is an Ideology of Despair." And it was describing how like a lot of what makes people interested in this is a sense that that they're losing, right? That, you know, that the conservatives are losing elections, they're losing social issues. And this came out in 2000, I think 18 or 19. So it captures that like post-Romney sort of shift of the new right. And the thing that they mostly argued against in the piece was that I had misspelled William Borman's name. And it had autocorrect to William Morgan, and I didn't notice it, and the editor didn't know the guy's name, so he thought that it was correct. And so there was an effort to delegitimize the argument on the basis that I was so careless as to get a typo into the piece, that who could trust me to argue correctly about the details of integralism. And this is very bad faith way of arguing, right?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and the closest that I've ever had, there's a guy named Nathan Pekoski who argued against a different...
Although I'll admit that I've broken out the your apostrophe RE or 2 TOO as a rebuttal to criticisms on X before.
Look,
I'm an American.
look, X is not where you go for like the highest, the highest caliber argumentation. But, there was this guy named Nathan Pekoski who was arguing against a different piece I wrote against integralism. And he said that he effectively called me a communist, and that there were certain details that he disagreed with. And so the trouble that you run into with a lot of this stuff is that because they're so aware of public perception, especially by way of social media, and because they don't like liberalism, right? They don't like the idea of open debate and
free exchange of ideas.
They treat all of the interactions that they have as strategic. And so if you try to debate them, they really won't debate you. This is a feature of a lot of their appearances. Adrian Vermeule very regularly does not allow questions when he speaks. And it's not always that this happens, but there's a kind of discouragement of that kind of exchange, because for them it's more of like a form of ideological programming than it is of sharing ideas and debating them, which makes sense if for them, because they're not really interested in participating in this kind of American system that you said they really don't like very much. Instead, they have this idea Adrian Vermeule came up with of the Empire Guadalupe, and this is the idea that you'd change immigration laws to facilitate the ease of movement of foreign Catholics into the United States. So there would essentially be this is what I mean about it being structurally conspiratorial. It's like replacement theory, but America becomes Catholic. It's this kind of like a goofy way of thinking. And this became a bit of a joke, even among them, right? Like there's another one named Jeremy Christensen who says future Attorney General for the Our Lady of Guadalupe Empire, right? So this is the kind of stuff that they talk about.
So an ideology that doesn't want to engage it doesn't want to engage liberalism even in a discussion about liberalism or about integralism. Doesn't take questions, doesn't debate.
And I should mention,
believes in Machiavelli. Yeah. Your term was Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends.
Correct.
Meaning, I just want to translate this for everybody. Meaning, we can lie to you.
Yes.
We can cheat. We can steal, so long as we're lying, cheating, and stealing in service of the beauty and the beauty of Christ's gospel reigning supreme. I mean, what a peculiar notion.
Yeah, of course, I always make this joke. It's like, I as a Catholic, I don't really read the Bible, right? But it sounds.
You own one.
Yeah, I own one,
a big one.
Yeah, but the priest reads it to me, right? And, but it's extremely unbiblical, right? And it's when. Put your faith not in princes, right? When Peter tries to brandish the sword, right? The thing that there are two swords, theology. Christ hasn't put it away. The sword is the weapon of the state. Instead, he heals the ear of the priest's servant. There's so many examples of the church not really exercising this degree of political authority, especially punitive political authority, and another thing is that often the things that they'll refer to are bad moments in the church. Like there's a bishop named Boniface VIII who wrote an epistle called Unum Sanctum, which establishes church sort of indirect papal authority over all kingdoms. And he didn't do this because he was a theologian proclaiming good doctrine. He proclaimed this because he was really mad at the King of France. And he's trying to get the King of France to stop taxing the church and to go on a crusade. And the outcome of Unum Sanctum is that the King of France, Philip the Fair, comes to Rome, kidnaps him, and then Boniface falls ill. Like I think he got beat up by French soldiers, but I have no historical proof of this, dies, and then you experience what's called the Babylonian captivity, in which there's the French insist that the Pope has to be crowned over in Avignon in France, where they can keep an eye on him. And then there's anti-popes in Germany. There's one, and it's just this huge Middle Ages mess. And so the citation of a lot of these very obscure, there's very few people who pay attention to things like Unum Sanctum or Philip the Fair. They don't know who any of this is. But when you learn about the citations that they're using, these obscure citations, it's always like right before disaster, right? It's almost like Christ knew in the Gospels that maybe when the church makes these moves, nothing good happens.
Well, this brings me back to that second category of Catholics whom I've encountered reacting to Insurrection Barbie's piece that sort of broke this out, I think, in some ways into the open. And that is cradle Catholics, meat and potatoes, everyday American Catholics who took offense because they aren't actually aware of integralism within Catholicism. And so, since they don't actually know what Insurrection Barbie is talking about, and listen, I'm not an expert to be able to read Insurrection Barbie's piece. I thought that the piece was essential reading. I knew the moment that I read it, I knew that it was going to be really change the conversation in the country. I also thought that there are places where even with as little knowledge as I have, it made conflations that probably it shouldn't have. It painted perhaps with too broad a brush. And yet I think that what she was trying to do and effectively did was very important, which was make this a mainstream part of the conversation. But if you're Catholic and you don't know that integralism is a real movement within American Catholicism today, you would read her piece and think she's attacking Catholics. And so I suppose there are two questions I want to get at here. I'll ask them sequentially instead of all at the same time. So I'll do the work instead of you having to do the work of keeping them separate. But my first question is, what do Catholic Americans need to know about what's happening with integralism inside of Catholicism?
So the answer is important. It's that Catholic integralism is rising, but it has not risen, right? It is, there's an important document that came out of the Second Vatican Council called Dignitatis Humanae that more or less put this to bed, that we were not going to tolerate any kind of arguments like this anymore. And they're sort of integralist attempts to kind of get out from under this. They're not very convincing, to say the least, considering that was the expressed intention behind this Second Vatican Declaration.
What does the Declaration posit?
Well, it's in the name. Dignitatis Humanae just is what it sounds like.
I barely speak English.
Well, let me tell you, I have never felt more like a professor during this interview than me doing that bit. I'm sorry. It's human dignity, right? So the idea is that people possess a right to religious liberty because they are human. So you can't do things like say to a person, well, you're unbaptized, so you can't be a citizen, right? That's a violation of the very nature of the person as God created him or her. And that's why a companion to Dignitatis Humanae was an epistle and a declaration called Nostra Aetate, which was the condemnation of anti-Semitism. And the church had a lot to account for because there were a lot of bad actors in the Catholic Church during the Second World War. There were a lot of good actors. It was like, Edith Stein and Maximilian Kolbe.
The church is a big place.
It's a big, messy place, and that's true of Catholics and Protestants. And so
I have my grievances with Catholicism, but as I often say, you're almost never going to find a water slide leading into the baptismal in a Catholic church. So we've all got our problems.
That's right. I always joke with my friends that are Protestant. It's like, you guys say that all of the pomp of the Catholic Mass with its incense, and then you guys bring in a smoke machine. It's the same.
It's the same thing. Yeah.
But
it's more crass. Let's be honest. The smoke machine is more crass.
Yeah, it doesn't smell like anything. Anyway, so the thing with ordinary Catholics is that this is like in some seminaries. And it's definitely in certain universities. Like I said, like at Ave, which it's not exclusively what they teach, I should say, but it's there.
But it's present.
Yeah, I mean, Sorba Mari was a fellow at Franciscan University of Steubenville. That's got some really great people there too. But there's a certain interest in this sort of thing. So a lot of the more traditionally Catholic schools have this. And that's because this is interesting intellectually, and so as you might imagine, people fall into that kind of temptation. But it's increasingly also in just conservative institutions,
right?
Like the Intercollegiate Studies Institute has, two integralists, Deneen and Chad Pecknold, operate their summer honors program, which is one of like the most important sort of entries into conservative politics. And so now they're the ones vetting the curriculum and the students who move through that process.
So you said earlier that the Integralists try to put forward integralism as the official political doctrine of the church, but it sounds like with these church documents that you're citing, that's certainly not the case.
So it's not only not the case, there's been movement on this. So there are two that I'll highlight. The first is the monk in Austria I mentioned earlier. His name's Edmund Waldstein, who is a lovely person from what I understand, but is very much an integralist of like the most strident variety. He is under what's called an apostolic visitation at his monastery in Austria because of concerns about...
What does that mean?
That means that the church is going there to see what's going on because they don't like what they're hearing. It's never good, right? It's like when the manager comes to your office about performance reviews. Yeah. It's not because you're doing well. That's not when the manager comes, right? So he's in trouble. In fact, the monastery generally is in trouble in the event that they might be tolerating this. And Waldstein's done things like favorably compare the theocracy of Iran to the United States, and goes to Qom in Iran, or has, or attempted to. I think one time he was sick. So it's weird. But now the church is like sufficiently concerned about this sort of thing that they're sending people. And the other is that, let's see if I can get the name right. Some of this is even more arcane for me to follow, but the Apostolic Nuncio, which is essentially a very fancy way of saying the ambassador from the Vatican to the United States, named Christophe Pierre. He's a cardinal. Cardinal Christophe Pierre wrote a talk and published it comparing post-liberalism or integralism to wokeness, saying that they're essentially like right or left-wing versions of each other, and that they're based off of partial truths, but both should ultimately be rejected. So when you have someone as high-ranking as a nuncio, a person who is there to supervise the Catholic Church in America for the Vatican, saying, cool it with this stuff, this is not church teaching, right? This stuff is dangerous.
Yeah.
Then it's definitely not the official political theology of the Catholic Church. Instead, it's stuff that was before sort of tolerated because they didn't want to cause a problem, and is now beginning to become a problem for the church.
One of the comparisons I make between Protestantism broadly, because you can only speak about Protestantism broadly because it isn't a centralized religious perspective, and Catholicism, is that both have weaknesses in their immune system in different places. And that's going to be true of any system, right? But because Catholicism is sacramental, because it's hierarchical, because it's centralized, it actually has a weakness in dealing with bad actors who are Catholic. It's not that it has no mechanism for dealing with bad actors who are Catholic. Of course it does. But the sacramental nature of Catholicism essentially makes it impossible to say that someone isn't Catholic on the basis of their words so much as their deeds. If it walks like a duck, it is a duck within Catholicism. That's not a perfectly true statement, but it's a broadly true statement. And Protestantism broadly doesn't have that problem because, if Candace Owens were a Baptist, there would be hundreds of Baptist preachers condemning her right now and saying that what she's doing to Erica Kirk, to TPUSA, and other places in her sort of media empire, 100% does not reflect the values of the Baptist Church. But you don't see priests saying that what Candace Owens is doing. You see very few priests who will make any sort of public statement because of this particular weakness within the immune system of Catholicism. It takes, to stop something like integralism. I mean, you can't stop integralism as a movement, but for the church to come down on integralism, it has to start very high up in the church and really push its way down in a way that a decentralized Protestantism doesn't have. And again, if we find 300 dead people with Kool-Aid cups in their hands, they ain't going to be Catholic. So, they're
Well, this is an extremely profound point. And it works in ways you wouldn't expect. A great example of this was during the civil rights movement. There's the letter from Birmingham jail. People often read it not realizing that there were specific clergymen addressed at the beginning, and their reaction you can follow on the basis of whether they're Presbyterian or if they're Episcopalian and model, Episcopalian little e and Presbyterian little p. If they had elder councils voting them in, they didn't march with King after that. But if they were Episcopal, if they were appointed by a bishop, they had the freedom to march. But you're right. The downside of that model is that the structures do not respond easily to pressure from below. Which is exactly what the Presbyterian model was attempting to accomplish by throwing out all the bishops. And in this case, there's an additional wrinkle, namely that the bishops in the United States don't get along. All right, they are very different.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're very different in what they think the church should be like. There's a lot of them, and they have a lot of rivalries. And that is a product of success, because for a long time, if you're suffering under various kinds of anti-Catholic sort of criticism, there's a kind of we're all in this together. Like, we may disagree, but let's leave them to the side. Catholics now are actually pretty free, right? In most cases, we got we had like a Catholic president under Biden. I mean, devotion aside, right? It didn't prove to be an issue for him. Maybe it's because people didn't perceive him as that religious, but we've got Catholics on the Supreme Court writing decisions and no one saying that the Pope wrote them.
A Catholic vice president.
Yeah, so this is not as much of an issue. And so now the bishops have nothing to kind of suppress the disagreements, and instead that's what constitutes things. And so what you get out of the official branch called the USCCB, United States Council of Catholic Bishops, is very milquetoast. Very like, what can we all agree on? The answer is almost nothing. And so everything is very carefully worded so that people's feelings aren't hurt and everyone gets the sentence they want changed. And so the church has really struggled, Catholic Church has really struggled with even setting this up, right? This is a slam dunk. This stuff's really bad, integralism. It's really bad and has a history only of achieving bad things. But partly they don't want to deal with it because they've got enough problems. This one doesn't seem all that salient yet. And the other is, as soon as you start having to explain why you disagree with something, everyone's priors have to be assessed, right? So Cardinal Supich up in Chicago, very progressive bishop, is not going to say the same thing as, a conservative bishop like Cordileone in San Francisco. So that's why you're so correct to point out that this has to be a top-down thing. The church designed itself this way. The Catholic Church designed itself to be top-down, and now it has to reap the whirlwind. And that it is good to see representatives of the Vatican doing that. But it's 10 years hence after this really became a movement getting going.
Yeah. Is it fair to say to mom and pop American Catholic, your kids are more likely to encounter this than you are?
Yes, absolutely. It's very much a social media phenomenon, and that's often used as a way to dismiss it. It's like, well, it's just online. Well, guess where most discourse occurs in the United States? It's online.
Do you think that so I've said that the average Catholic isn't familiar with integralism.
Mm-hmm.
A variation on the question. In political circles, in Catholic youth circles, is the average Catholic who is sympathetic to integralism familiar with the full implications of integralism?
That's an important question. That's an important question because the answer is usually no. Especially for Catholics that attend either non-sectarian or very loosely sectarian Catholic schools. They don't actually know anything about this stuff. And so the first person that will speak to them and make them feel like they belong to something is going to have an advantage. And that person could be like, I remember now there was something I wanted to say about the insurrection Barbie thing. So I might try to like kind of feather these together. If the very first person to tell them about this is like, well, if you really want to understand what Catholic politics is, you should listen to Nick Fuentes.
Right.
And Nick Fuentes then, fulminates about the Jews for an hour, and, that's what you get. And I actually had, when I was at Ave Maria, I think I had a student who had that experience and came to me and he goes, what is all this about the Jews? And I was like, what? And he's like, I watched Nick Fuentes. And I was like, he's an entertainer. All right. He's selling you a product. The product is bad. Watch something else. And, I talked about like early Nick Fuentes was very different from now, right? He had like way different content. Maybe we shouldn't talk about it on here, but it was very salacious. And not to leave aside like all the terrible things he was saying about women and Jews this whole time.
Is Fuentes an integralist?
No. Fuentes is an opportunist. He doesn't seem to have any real political beliefs beyond what will draw attention to himself. And then he convinced himself of these positions because that's what he needed in order to keep making a living. At a certain point, you make enough Nazi comments or anti-Semitic comments where you're basically unemployable. So now you just gotta kind of go for it, right? So he's kind of like live streamed himself into a content corner. And that was the thing about the Insurrection Barbie post that I think was a miss, right? Like she assumes too much coordination. Right. And the real thing about Fuentes is that he's a rival to Integralists.
Interesting. How so?
Gen Z does not read Patrick Deneen. Millennials do. That book came out in 2018, which for people our age seems not that long ago, but for people who are 20 years old, that was a long time ago. They watched Nick Fuentes. And so in order to keep up, you have to essentially find a way to reach these kids. That's why something like having a control over these conservative vetting organizations is so important. We'll get them eventually, and then they'll be with us. But if you're listening to Fuentes, you are not listening to these people. And so a lot of the efforts to kind of tie all these together assumes that these people would all have the same common interests because they have the same ideological ends. Well, they kind of don't have the same ideological ends, but they definitely don't see each other as friends because there's only so much time in the day. There's only so much influence you can have. And when someone is contesting that role for you, if someone, the new person that they're all going to look to isn't you, now you're less relevant. Now you'll have less leverage. And so it's actually an element that goes back to a lot of these historical governments that had integralists in them, is that integralists often had to fight with the pure fascists or the military or the clergy that didn't like them, right? And that's the thing about politics so often, is that it's zero sum, that there's always competition over these things, hence why these people wouldn't want to coordinate with each other.
Have the integralists ever succeeded in any country around the world?
The extent to which we have seen integralism succeed, you could say, is in one of three countries. The first would be Spain, under a man named Francisco Franco, who won the Spanish Civil War against what was called the Spanish Republic. And what Franco did is ally himself with the fascists and Nazis, who were really the main contributors to the victory over the Spanish Republicans, although he had a larger army. And then the regime that he starts is one that is expressly integralist. It is a Catholic dictatorship. And he refers to himself as the dictator by the grace of God, or el caudillo por la gracia del Dios, and imposes his view of what Catholic economics is supposed to be, called corporatism. Corporatism doesn't mean that corporations are good. That's often how it's used in America. What it means instead is that the government and corporations coordinate decisions together. And the decisions that Franco wanted them to make was to exclude as much foreign trade as possible. And for Spain to grow its own food, to mine its own resources, assemble its own goods, and provide its own services. And the result was 20 years of starvation and what's called the Hunger Years. And it's not until Franco begins to feel more control over the government, and he begins to take his foot off the gas, and the formation of an order in Spain called Opus Dei, right? Very Dan Brown conspiracy. They're actually like they're bureaucrats. It's not very interesting, right? But and they essentially orchestrate what's called the Spanish miracle, often by people who are Francophiles, if you will. But there was a reason why there was a Spanish miracle, is all the solutions to the problems of Spain were Franco's fault, and all you had to do was stop doing them. And then Spain suddenly isn't starving to death because they're importing food. I mean, who knew? But another example would be Ireland prior to maybe the 1990s. The joke was that, like they would show you a picture in Ireland. There was it said holy water dispenser, and it was just like a giant thing that you could turn open, and all this holy water would come out, and you would take a bucket, and that's what Irish grandmas would do when they would go into town. And the idea would be that establishing this the Catholic theology in the Constitution, in the name of the Blessed Trinity, it opens, right? They prohibit abortion in the Constitution. There's a lot of favors given to the Catholic Church. And this is very similar to the third case, which is Quebec in Canada. And one of the things you'll know about all three of these countries, they do very much the same thing. And I don't want to repeat myself. Your audience doesn't need to listen to that. What all these three countries have in common now is that they have some of the lowest religiosity. Ireland is held up by old people.
Yeah.
But if you remove old people and just look at younger people, they are some of the most militantly secular people. And it's because the establishment of this Catholic Church meant that it was implicated in all the terrible decisions of the country. And in Spain, intentionally so. And so if you oppose Franco, if you oppose the government in Ireland or Quebec, then you oppose the Catholic Church.
You necessarily oppose the Catholic Church.
And so people disaffiliate, or, in some other countries, especially in Latin America, they become Protestants, right? Because if you favor freedom from a corrupt regime, and the Catholic Church supports it, then you just go be Protestant, so you can be in political alignment with your more broadly. So this is the thing that happens so often, is that these efforts to create these confessional states backfire, and they actually make them secular states almost within a generation.
Is there an anti-Semitism problem in the Catholic Church?
Yes, and it's old. It's been a problem for a very long time. You'll often see people quoting church fathers from the early years of the 500s. They'll talk like John Chrysostom, and it's that line from Scripture: "Surely not I, Lord." Right? I'm not the reason for the crucifixion. I would not have yelled, away with him, crucify him, crucify him. They would do it, right? It was the Jews, right? I'm not the bearer of this sin. And it's yeah, you are, right? But this instinct has been part of Christianity for a long time. I mean, Martin Luther had this problem, right? In his writing, he spends a lot of time talking about the Jews. So it is not just Catholic, but in the Catholic Church, it was also a way of explaining something that happened in the 19th century. I got at this a little bit earlier. I didn't want to talk about it too much because I don't want to sound like I'm rehearsing a conspiracy theory. But the downside to these this embrace of the sacral monarchy of Louis IX is that if these regimes are perfect, why do they fall apart? And the answer can't be that Louis IX did anything wrong. He's a saint, right? And the answer can't be that the Catholic Church did anything wrong, because the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So I have an idea. I know who was there the whole time, just beneath, the surface, and it was the Jews. And so a way of exonerating yourself politically is to blame a minority of people. And in the case of the Jews, there are these historical curiosities. The first is that because there's no prohibition on lending to strangers in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, they do that. And the Catholic Church had prohibitions on this. And so Jews become money lenders just by historical accident of the laws. This isn't true in other parts of the world where Jews exist, or not as much. And also because they're minorities, they have the advantage that accrues to minorities. And people don't normally think about that.
High trust. Success is bad for cohesion.
Yeah.
I mean, one reason that these so-called integralist confessional nations become secular within a generation is the same reason there's a civil war now on the American right. It's because coalitions need outside pressures.
That's right.
And once you ascend to power, it's very hard to keep your coalition together.
And this is also why Jews have always been more progressive, because the ending of these sacral kingships meant the ending of Jewish ghettos. It meant the end of mandatory sort of like religious tests to qualify for office. And so they like the secular state because it was what liberated them. And it's something that doesn't really track in the American imagination, because that's not who frees you here. You are who's free. You were always supposed to be free. And there's legacies like in the way that, like, you know, some Jewish Americans in the Northeast vote Democratic because there were so-called red diaper babies, right? But like Catholics used to vote for Democrats because that's where the Catholics were represented. Over in Europe, these valences are different, especially on the continent and in Ireland, where, as you said, like Jews had high trust and they also operated in banking because of historical accident. And so it was easy to blame them because no one likes bankers. Right. And before it was the Jews, the Italians were the bankers, right? And they were getting in lots of trouble in England for engaging in these kinds of debt, the applications of debt collection. So, you know, in the United States, where you didn't associate banking with Jews because there weren't a lot of Jews here in the 19th century, they were just bankers. You just said bankers and you knew who you were talking about. So, you know,
and again, because law has enormous social implication. In America, we adhered largely to a biblical Jewish idea that debts can be forgiven every 7 years.
Yeah.
And so America didn't develop the hatred for bankers because there was some recourse. You didn't go to a debtor's prison.
Yeah, that's true about America, because we had a very liberal bankruptcy law until we got too rich.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, it's the same way with intellectual property. Back when we were stealing from Europe like every day, we were like, no, intellectual property laws are a joke, right? Now that we produce intellectual property, we're going around telling people to stop putting music in their YouTube videos.
Right. Why should I be Catholic?
Well, the Catholic Church is the source and summit of the revelation of the gospel by bringing into the world the Holy Eucharist, by which you must be saved. You must eat my flesh or drink my blood or you'll have no life in you. And so that's, you know, John 6:56. He repeats it. People are like, what are you saying? He repeats it, and then a bunch of people leave. But that is the nature of the church, as many are called, few are chosen. And so it is difficult to bring people in because of the challenges that are before you when you have to do this sort of thing. Be baptized, receive Eucharist, and submit to the authority of the church. And it is especially hard to do when the church itself, you know, is like the church of the apostles, where one of them would betray Christ. And so the betrayal that bishops often perform is the most difficult part. And it's one that I think has been persistent with everything from 2001 and the cover-ups to the present, is not so much the theology, but the scandal that the bishops bring in. Although there are some people who are theologically inclined against it. So, you know, that's the thing about all this, is that I just gave you what sounded like integralism, right? I'm actually like not all, not a lib. I'm a really like, you should become Catholic. And if you want to become Catholic, I will help you with that. But you should not be forced to be Catholic. That is reprehensible to me. And that's why, you know, I speak out against it so much.
Is there a Catholic case for republicanism, lowercase r?
I'm not sure if you knew this, but like that's like my next book project. If you did, then well done.
I'm good at my job. We're getting close to wrapping up. We got to plug.
We got to plug.
Why Post-Liberalism Failed.
Yeah, so there is a book that is coming out called Why Post-Liberalism Failed. I co-author with a really smart guy from Princeton, you know, as you might expect, Thomas Howes. He's We have a YouTube channel that we seasonally post to when we're working on stuff. Although we might just have one more season by the same name, Why Post-Liberalism Failed. And we have it's not this. All right, we're on the webcam, so definitely the audio is fine too, right? Because you're not missing a lot. It's not really high production values. It's two webcams, and early on, I think he's using AirPods for mics.
Sure.
No, you're gonna get Bluetooth echo. I know, but look, man, when your budget is negative $100.
Hey, I know the budget for the Jordan Peterson show, and we still couldn't get that guy not to wear Bluetooth AirPods for his.
It is not good to wear Bluetooth anyway. And so that's going to be coming out on Acton Institute Press. Currently, for those of you who know book stuff, we are in the stage of what's called putting together galleys.
Yeah.
And so these are the proofs to make sure the book looks right. So that means it should be out, in like about 4 or 5 months. I have just signed a contract for the next book that I'm going to write with the University of Notre Dame Press, and it's called Americanism Redeemed, and it's actually about the development of Catholic republicanism in the United States. So it's essentially the positive case. Like, I've done this like integralism bad thing. It's a big old book, and now it's like, well, what do you do now?
Right.
And the answer is that actually American Catholics have done that for a long time. And the case there is that, there's the sort of development era when Catholics are a very small minority. And then as they increase in number through like the famine immigration and immigration from the 1848ers that come in, they build a kind of Catholic republicanism here that gets them in trouble. The thing that I was talking about earlier with Americanism. And then that Americanism itself becomes a major contribution to the post-Second World War understanding of America, America as a pluralistic nation, but also Catholic Church uses those same ideas in a lot of its application of its own political theology. Hence, why it abandons any kind of integralist arguments altogether.
So my last question: I've been party to a conversation in the wake of the Insurrection Barbie piece, in which Catholic friends of mine who see themselves as integralists have put forward the idea that integralism actually isn't novel. It's just a Catholic flavor on a sort of foundational American idea that John Adams says our Constitution is only for a Christian people, a moral people, a religious and moral people, that it's wholly insufficient to govern any other kind of people, that it will fail if we try to use it in that way. And that really all they're saying is, from John Adams to today, we've known that the American system only actually works if Christian values are the bedrock. And all we're saying is that those values should be not lowercase c Christian, but uppercase C Catholic values. This conversation makes me think that that is not a fair perspective, although I think it's being honestly communicated. In other words, I don't think that these are people using Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends. This tells me that there's a broad group of people who see themselves as integralists who've encountered what we might call like lowercase I integralism.
Yes.
They're beginning to encounter, everybody knows something's been broken in the system. The American system has become too secularized. We're trading in so much of the values on which the country was founded for a not no values, but worse values, a lesser set of values.
Yeah.
There's a desire among American evangelicals, among even certain mainline Protestants, and certainly among Catholics and among Jews. The religious variety in all four cases, like actual devoted people who practice their faith, not people who are lapsed, to sort of return God to a place of central authority over American public life. Not to replace the American system with a system in which there's no freedom of religion, not to replace the American system in a way that is no longer a representative, lowercase d, democratic system. How do we help those people who I would argue are not only well-meaning, but perhaps the most well-meaning, who not only love America, but are patriots, but who believe that the moral core, the Christian core, has been removed, and therefore what's left cannot stand for much longer. How do we empower that group of people to effectuate that kind of change in the culture, but not see them be pushed into a place where they either become unwitting participants in, or perhaps over time are converted to be full participants in what's actually a very subversive movement, as you've described it, to actually overturn the country itself?
So I actually take people at their word when they call themselves integralists, and then what they're describing doesn't really map on to what I just, spent this time talking about.
Right.
Because often that's just the term that they know.
Yeah, we're all reaching for language all the time.
Yeah, and the idea of there being a robust public Christian witness is not integralism. You don't need to have papal indirect control over government for that. We had that for a long time. And so if this is a specific question to Catholics, the answer is that there needs to be a rediscovery of the ministry of soon to be beatified Fulton J. Sheen. Sheen, he won an Emmy in the 1950s, and one of there's a line from him, where he's talking about communists, and he says, the choice before the world is not a humanitarian state in communism, but brotherhood in Christ or comradeship in Antichrist.
Oh.
And that sounds, quote, integralist, but what it really is just an authentic witness to the horrors of communism, and that ideological commitments to things like that will cause you to defy the Christian way of living, dissolve entire populations with starvation, or, rounding people up and shooting them. But when he said that, he was saying that to an audience of a pluralistic group, right? Not everyone was Catholic. And they all clapped because they liked what he had to say. And so the Christian witness in public is something that became so hard to make. Like in the 1950s, we were in the middle of a massive religious revival. Not just Sheen, Billy Graham, right? All these major figures that were, in the White House. Like, Billy Graham's meeting with Nixon. Sheen is, meeting with Eisenhower. And so if you're recently, getting into politics and you're young, you'll know DEI and offensive language. And so you feel like you have to fight that fire with fire. And that means, we're going to have DEI, but it's going to be Catholic DEI, right? And so you'll have to say a Catholic prayer before every lunch.
Christ is king.
Yeah, Christ is king. Christ is king is that is so important. This language where you're essentially coercing people with language. This effort to coerce people with language is the same thing as saying, using the correct pronouns. So there's other ways of doing this. It's just that it's very hard to socialize people into those older ways because fewer people do them, and there's a lot of competition for people's time.
Yeah.
So the classic advice is still true. Log off, right? Just if you find yourself constantly feeling like there's just a tragic moment, any moment now, where everything's going to be lost. No. This country was at war for 5 years with tens of thousands of people dead every day in massive battles across the country. We had a mass mobilization of this country fighting a two-front war after being bombed and engaging in mechanized warfare that led to just unbelievable casualties. All right. What we have right now is a limited bombing operation in Iran, and that's it. All right. We are not on the precipice here. Human beings live in a sinful world. The government under which we live has a constitution that accommodates that sinfulness, which means there's going to be a lot of nonsense. Yeah. There needs to be a much higher toleration for people just being kind of bad. Among the many things that are virtuous about popular government, that it is accommodating, that it is often a source of wealth, that it is a source of freedom. Nobody says it's a source of like grand virtue. All right. No, that is like as far back as Plato. Like democracies are well known to be like full of lousy people. And that's going to be the way it is. You know, you're not going to have heroes like, you know, King Arthur, because you need a king to do that. But the problem is that for every King Arthur, you get 100 lousy kings.
Richard III's.
Yeah, you get like putting all your faith in princes. So don't put your faith in princes, right? Put faith in institutions that are actually worth your time, not social media accounts. Although it sounds like I'm very online from this conversation. It's my job. But rather like just go to church. Go to church, do church stuff. That's what it's there for. And they'd be happy to have you, right? Join civic organizations like, you know, the Knights of Columbus or the Kiwanis, or, you know, they'll be glad to have you. They actually do good work. I used to be an active knight in rural Virginia, and, you know, I stood outside of Walmart and raised money for disabled kids, and we took a washing machine to an old lady's house. I mean, it doesn't sound like much, but you have light domestic beverages afterwards.
Oh, yeah. And on such things, societies are built.
Everyday interactions among ordinary people, making each other's lives a little better.
And go to church.
And go to church.
James Patterson, thank you.